hold on. Is it true that we are witnessing the explosion of yet another celebrity situation? Or is this going to turn into something much more significant than anyone anticipated? Because just when everyone thought that Cardi B and Stefon Diggs' relationship couldn't get much worse, new information has surfaced. Naturally, young Miami is now being pulled right into the center of it. And music. No, this isn't the usual drama of them unfollowing one another. We're talking about purportedly leaked discussions, late-night connections that no one was supposed to know about, and internet reactions that are described as raw, unexpected, and genuinely too real to ignore. Thus, there is currently only one query on the internet: music. Was there a leak? Or did someone at last witness what they were never meant to see? Because the entire atmosphere has entirely changed. There is no longer any sense of silent strain. It seems like something went wrong behind the scenes, and whatever it was may have caused the situation to spiral out of control. Furthermore, this is more than simply drama if even half of what is being asserted today turns out to be accurate. This is a real-time, full-fledged celebrity meltdown. Music people didn't first notice the distance between Cardi B and Stefon Diggs before the problem truly began to take traction. It was when the story subtly changed from something that seemed strange to something that might have truly occurred. Music. The tale starts to appear extremely different from what people were hyping up online if you rewind even a little bit. So that change didn't just happen. Everything about their relationship initially seemed almost too ideal, as if it had been thoughtfully planned in the greatest possible way. Appearances in public that appeared to be timed perfectly, energy that was both naturally occurring and suspiciously camera-ready, the kind of chemistry that doesn't just appear when two well-known figures are in the public eye all the time. People were buying into the whole concept of them, not simply observing them. And that's precisely why things feel different right now. Because those same seemingly effortless moments are now being chosen, separated by an entirely different lens. It seems as though there might have been more going on beneath every smile, appearance, and conversation. Music. At this point, the situation becomes awkward. Because the first genuine indications of strain didn't originate from anything public, according to numerous online conversations and circulating insider rumors. They originated from minor personal irregularities that gradually began to pile up in the background. We're discussing adjustments that didn't initially appear significant, calls that required greater privacy out of the blue, messages that began to vanish a bit too quickly. There were times when communication didn't feel as transparent as it once did, currently by themselves. Not one of that might imply anything. In their way of life, privacy is commonplace. The schedules are disorganized. Music. When people are continually under observation, their movements change. However, such minor adjustments cease to seem random when they recur. And that's just what those with knowledge of the matter are now implying. Because something new began to emerge as those patterns continued to develop. A name that repeatedly appeared in the same setting: Young Miami. No one really listened to music at first. Industry circles frequently cross paths. Celebrities converse, they work together. They attend the same gatherings, parties, and private dinners with music. That is meaningless on its own. However, based on what is currently being discussed on other platforms, this no longer seemed like random overlap. This had a steady feel. Music. A hint of familiarity in the messages, discussions that alluded to unreleased music plans, allusions to instances that deviated from what was visible to the public. And since nothing was genuinely confirmed, this is where things get complex. No verifiable screenshots, no direct statements, no official leaks, just patterns. Additionally, there are instances when music patterns are sufficient to sow uncertainty. This is where the tale takes a turn that no one really anticipated, because the version of events being described implies that Cardi B did not immediately face anything rather than responding immediately. She waited, observed, and listened. If that's the case, then everything is different because it's one thing to respond emotionally, but it's quite another to observe in silence. Music. This indicates that it wasn't an abrupt explosion. This was something that accumulated over time, and it is said that more pieces began to fit together as it did. There were times when explanations didn't quite connect, travel plans that didn't exactly match public appearances, GAN moves that felt a little strange. Once more, none of this demonstrates music of any kind. However, when the same discrepancies persist, they begin to take on a form that is difficult to ignore. Naturally, the internet intervened after that because things quickly get out of control once fans begin to notice trends. Old clips began to reappear. Attention began to focus on sightings. Music. People started pointing out instances where young Miami and Stefon seemed to be in similar places at the same time. Not once, not twice, but enough times for music to cause listeners to pause and reflect. After that, people begin making connections. This is the problem with the internet. It doesn't await verification. Music. It creates stories. Furthermore, once a narrative has momentum, it transcends the real facts. Or music. That's precisely what began to occur here, because what might have begun as calm conjecture swiftly developed into a full-fledged discussion. Were they only going around in circles, or was there anything going on that shouldn't have been made public? Perception began to change at that time. Every new detail is now seen through an entirely different lens, which causes everything to change once perception does. Music. Things that used to seem regular suddenly seem suspect. Conversations that used to feel sincere now seem staged. Even silence becomes noisier. Furthermore, that change didn't only occur online, according to the version of events that is currently making the rounds. It also took place behind the scenes, because there comes a time when simply watching is insufficient. Answers to questions are necessary. Think music. At that point, a direct discussion is said to have broken out. Now, the outcome of that interaction can vary greatly depending on who you believe. According to some, everything was categorically rejected. Others claim that the atmosphere quickly changed, turning from serene to tense more quickly than anyone had anticipated. Frustration took the place of that clarity. Here's the one thing, though. Thing remains the same in all music versions of the narrative. In reality, nothing was resolved. And that's precisely what people are fixated on, because straightforward queries tend to increase rather than decrease skepticism when they don't yield clear answers. And it becomes nearly impossible to ignore that skepticism once it reaches a certain point. This is the point at which timing becomes really questionable. Because something else was happening in the public eye while all that tension was silently developing behind the scenes. One of the largest entertainment events of the year, Super Bowl weekend, is full of VIP events, private parties, and celebrity get-togethers that aren't often captured on camera. Additionally, according to what is currently being discussed, it got more difficult to ignore some overlaps in that setting because several sources began to allude to the same thing. Music that young Miami might have frequented the same areas as Stefon. Once more, nothing was verified. However, individuals were no longer even concerned with confirmation at this time. It was the timing, the rhythm, and the music repetition, and sometimes that's all it takes. Because it ceases to feel like a coincidence when the same elements consistently appear in the same context. And based on the story that is currently gaining traction, music could have been the turning point. Because up until that point, there was still space for uncertainty, for explanations. There is yet hope. Everything was simply misinterpreted. However, that area began rapidly contracting after that. At this point, the situation becomes even more intense, because the public was unaware that all of this was taking place behind closed doors. Music. Everything appeared peaceful, orderly, and normal from the outside. However, based on the current discussion, that serenity did not represent reality, because the situation was reaching a breaking point behind that image. Done music. Things seldom remain silent for very long once they get to that point. Every time something comes out, there's always a change. Additionally, in this circumstance, it had already. And that alteration didn't remain undetected because shortly afterward, something began to take place that fundamentally altered the atmosphere. Quiet conjecture gave way to a discussion that people began to consider as though it had real substance. Music. Something more powerful than previously, but not verified facts or official declarations, because people were observing more than simply patterns at this point. Music. They were making claims. Conversations that no longer appeared to be random were mentioned, according to what started making the rounds on various online platforms. Messages that implied familiarity beyond superficial engagement, or depending on how you interpreted them, not loud, not overt, but deliberate. Music. At this point, things start to become much more awkward since people start to think that real conversations were taking place behind closed doors. Music. Who was seen there is no longer important. It starts to focus on what might have been going on when nobody was around. At that point, the topic of leaks comes up. Let's be clear now. Nothing confirmed has been made available to the public. No official recordings, no verified screenshots, nothing that can be considered indisputable evidence. However, the story continued to intensify music, since, according to internet rumors, there were assertions that people close to the situation, music had witnessed several talks that were being conducted in private. Before gradually making their way to the general public, the information was circulated in tiny circles. And once that notion gained traction, the whole atmosphere changed once more, because fans were no longer speculating. Behind the scenes, it seemed like something was genuinely happening. People began posing various queries, not as something that was happening, but what was said specifically. This distinction is important because one is motivated by curiosity, while the other is motivated by suspicion. Music. At the same time, conduct began to be examined in greater detail. Videos from the past were reviewed. Previous exchanges were replayed. Moments that had before seemed unimportant were now regarded as proof. And once the internet begins to do that, things quickly get out of control because every little piece of information becomes a part of a larger story. Every coincidence becomes a potential link, and every quiet becomes more powerful than any words. This is where things start to change again, because something was allegedly going on behind closed doors that folks initially didn't completely get when all of this was developing publicly. A response to music. Not just any reaction, but one that others on the internet began characterizing as entirely unprecedented in this circumstance. Because everything in music felt measured and under control up to that point. It appeared to be handled discreetly, even when things became tense. However, that control began to erode now. Cardi B answered that she no longer simply ignored anything, according to numerous online conversations. In music with energy that seemed impossible to ignore, but not with blatant accusations or unambiguous confirmations. People cited instances where her response no longer felt ambiguous, citing tone, language, and music. It attracted attention because it felt intimate, because a transition from silent observation to outward reaction typically indicates an interior alteration. They were no longer able to remain silent for whatever reason. Music. Once more, no direct statement was made. There were no obvious names called out. No specific claims have been verified. However, people weren't merely listening to what was being spoken. Thus, the change was sufficient. Music. They were observing the delivery of the statement. Music. Those who listened closely reported that it seemed as though patience had been replaced with frustration. And music, like inquiries that lead to conclusions. There is no turning back to uncertainty after that. Simultaneously, another factor began to exacerbate the issue: quiet. Because the other side remained silent while everything on the internet grew louder. No explanations, no refutations, and no attempts to stop anything. Furthermore, quiet is ineffective in such circumstances. It exacerbates the situation, because individuals start coming up with their own solutions when they don't receive any, and that is precisely what took place. Theories began to proliferate. Some people thought everything that was being told was accurate. Some believed it was overstated. Music. Some said it was all a miscommunication, but regardless of people's opinions, one thing remained clear. This was no longer a minor issue. It had become a full-fledged discussion. Then an additional layer appeared, intensifying the whole situation: lifestyle specifics. People begin to view everything through that prism, including money, access, music, and conduct, if they start to believe that anything is happening. There have been assertions made in some internet forums of special dinners and exclusive venues, settings that are difficult to enter, and occasions that would call for preparation, coordination, music, and intention. Once more, nothing was confirmed, but the notion by itself was enough to spark conversation, because it implied that if something was occurring, it wasn't coincidental. It was intentional. Music. And that possibility altered people's perceptions of things, since it was no longer solely about feeling. It has to do with effort. Additionally, and choice is always implied by effort, the story, music, had completely changed by now. What had begun as a calm suspicion was now being examined from every angle. Every aspect of behavior, timing, emotions, and silence was scrutinized. And one question, music, kept coming up throughout it all. Why does everything seem to be occurring if nothing is? What kept the conversation going was that question, due to the lack of a definitive response. And the narrative continued to develop in the absence of music clarity. However, this was something that most people were unaware of at the time. Not even the largest change had occurred yet, because something was still developing behind the scenes while the internet was occupied with debating potential outcomes. Whatever it was going to elevate this issue to a whole new plane. And that next-level music didn't come gently, because just when people believed things had reached their pinnacle, something else happened that made everything feel even more immediate, real, and, to be honest, much more difficult to write off as internet noise. The response persisted. It got worse. Music. At that precise moment, the tone of the entire narrative changed permanently, because everything up until that point could yet be debated. The significance of those patterns, whether the overlaps were really coincidental, and whether the responses were being misinterpreted, were all topics of discussion. However, opinions were no longer the only factor. It had to do with how everything was happening in real time, because the atmosphere surrounding Cardi B didn't return to normal. Music. It remained distinct, more straightforward, or more sentimental and more conscious. And that's what caused people to become even more vigilant. Because when a person doesn't go back to their former self, it usually indicates that they have already undergone a permanent, inward transformation. Meanwhile, Stefon and Young Miami remained silent, making no abrupt remarks or attempts to clarify anything, making no apparent attempt to address what had grown to be one of the most talked about online discussions. Music. And that silence had the exact opposite effect of calming things down. People were no longer merely speculating, which made everything louder. They were observing, waiting, and scrutinizing every action, post, and appearance in an effort to find evidence that would support or refute the narrative that had already taken control. Then something else began to occur. See, the public's response started to diverge. On the one hand, there were others who believed that the timing, the reactions, and the quiet all pointed in the same direction, that the pattern was too consistent to ignore, and that too many music aspects lined up in a way that didn't feel accidental. Conversely, There were many who argued that this is precisely how rumors get out of hand, that everything being addressed was merely interpretation in the absence of substantial evidence. Music, coincidence, time, and perspective were all combined to tell a story that may or may not be true. Music. And that gap is precisely what exacerbated the crisis, because it was now a debate rather than just a story. Debates also don't go away easily. They develop, proliferate, and attract more individuals. And that is just what took place in this instance. More videos began to appear. Music. More moments were re-examined. More discussions about what might have transpired behind closed doors started to emerge. Doors. And one notion in music continued to become stronger throughout all of that. That the truth is complicated, whatever it may be. People anticipated a quick resolution if this was simply a misunderstanding. People expected someone to shut it down if it was wholly untrue. However, neither of those events took place. Additionally, speculation fills the void left by a lack of clarification and denial. That's precisely where this tale resides. Right now, the situation's effects began to manifest in subtle ways in that area between what is known and what is simultaneously assumed. Music, not public breakdowns or dramatic statements, but changes in presence, changes in the public handling of the situation. There were times when it seemed as though the distance was being revealed rather than merely imagined. At that point, people began saying things that advanced this discussion even farther. Perhaps there was more than one issue involved. Music. Perhaps it was a realization. Because when a person stops responding emotionally and begins acting differently, it typically indicates that an internal decision has already been made. Music. People started to sense that a resolution had already been reached, regardless of what transpired behind the scenes. This is where things become even more intriguing, because despite all that has been said, studied and examined, there is still not a single verified version of the truth, just fragments, responses, patterns, and perception. No official explanation, no confirmed chronology. Furthermore, perception moves more quickly than facts in the modern world. Music. Before clarity has a chance to catch up, it forms opinions. That's precisely what made this much more than a private matter, because it's no longer only about what really transpired between Young Miami, Stefon, Music Digs, and Cardi B. It's about what people think took place. And whether or not it is verified, once individuals have a strong enough belief, it becomes part of the story. The issue hasn't slowed down because of this. People continue to watch because everyone is waiting for that one moment, that one piece of information, that one confirmation that either dramatically changes the narrative or proves everything. However, this scenario remains unresolved, ambiguous, music, and impossible to ignore until that moment arrives. Because what happened isn't the most important question at the moment. It's what hasn't been made public yet, and whether the music behind the scenes, where this whole narrative began, would finally be revealed or remain precisely where it is. It all boils down to this now. What do you really think is happening here? What do you actually believe is going on?